The opinions expressed by the host and guests in this show are not necessarily the views of Children's Health Defense.
Good morning, CHD. I'm here today with two farmers, and they are also podcasters, Jim and Shad, Jim Mundorf and Shad Sullivan. And we're going to talk about what it takes to be a farmer today, what are the trials and tribulations, what's good about it, and what it would take for a new person to come in and try to be a farmer. So let me take it away with either Jim or Shad. Tell us about your family farm, what you raise, what is good and bad about it, what does it take to be your kind of farmer, and what are the challenges? Thanks.
You want me to go first?
Sure.
Yeah, so I would, in ag, I guess a lot of people will say their generation of how many generations have been in it. I'm the fifth generation in this part of the country in Southwest Iowa. We are about 40 miles straight east of Omaha, Nebraska, if that gives some people an idea. We farm. I am pretty much a hired man on my farm while I do other things. That's what I've kind of done all my life. And on our family farm, we do corn and soybeans, and then we have a cow-calf herd. And so, but yeah, my great-great-grandpa moved here in 1874. And so we just got an award for 150 years as a family farm in Iowa. But yeah, as far as, challenges and I mean, there's there's a lot to talk. I mean, right now it's just grain prices are really low. That's the challenge. And then the beef market is at a place it's never been before. So that's, I am Shad will be better at explaining how that affects him, but it's really just a market. If you talk about right now, what's going on in the world, these markets are very hard to figure out and to know what's going to happen next. So.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree more. My name is Shad Sullivan, and I too am a generational rancher. I'm a fifth generation. My family came to southeast Colorado pre-1900 and settled the plains southeast of Colorado Springs. We've been there ever since. We are primarily a stocker operation, which means that we buy the calf from the people that have the cow and calf, and then I grow that calf to a certain stage. And so, or a certain stage or a certain weight. That calf will then be sold off of grass, and they will go into another sector of the beef industry, whether that be straight to slaughter or to a feed yard to gain more weight or more age. And then we also have a small cow-calf operation in Texas where I sell that meat I raise that calf to a certain stage, and then we slaughter that off of wheat or grass, and we sell it to the consuming public. So it's a farm to plate program. We are primarily just ranchers. We farm a little bit to run cattle on wheat in the wintertime in Texas, and then we take those cattle to grass in Colorado. I've been involved in agriculture my whole life, and I came through the 1980s with my family during the farm crisis, and there are a lot of challenges. And really, everything in agriculture, production agriculture, is a challenge except your work ethic and your dedication, right? So the weather can be a challenge. The markets are certainly a challenge. Right now, the greatest challenge in the beef industry is access to capital, because we are at unseen heights in prices in the beef industry, beef and cattle industry. And so the access to capital seems to be the major challenge. We also have policy challenges. We have allowed centralization to creep into our beef and cattle system over the last 40 years. And with that centralization, we have replaced corporatism, or replaced independent ranchers with corporatism. So that's kind of where we are. It's a challenge to get into the industry now, just because it takes so much access, so much capital, and that is limited in access to buy or rent land and then purchase the animals as well. COVID did us a favor, and it made American producers and consumers recognize that centralization is dangerous. And so we have the regenerative movement that has come along, the farm to table movement that has come along, and that has helped prop up independent farmers and ranchers across the nation where they had largely been forgotten over the last 40 years. So my activism is all about property rights and freedom and liberty, and how that is interwoven into the beef and cattle industry and really the agricultural industry as a whole.
So tell us what the crisis was for farmers in the 1980s, if you would, Shad.
Well, um, the crisis of the 80s was really also access to capital. You know, interest rates had gone sky high. People were laden with debt, were trying to hold what they had inherited or what they had put together. They were trying to hold it together, and the interest rates just would not allow that. If you'll remember the interest rates, I can remember my dad talking about interest rates being up to 21%, and it really affected our operation. He had some small ranches put together, and we had to, he lost a couple of those and had to sell a ranch, all to save one. And it was a burden that lasted for decades afterwards. It certainly changed who my dad was before the 1980s. He was a very aggressive cattleman, great businessman, and had a lot of confidence in what he was doing. He had paid for those ranches. And then they decided they would buy my mom's home ranch in southeast Colorado. And he told me before he died, he said, I had a feeling that we shouldn't have bought that because interest rates were starting to roll up there. And they did. They went ahead and bought it, and in 5 years, it was just a whole different story in production. And you know, that was one of the issues that has really fueled the mental health crisis in agriculture. You know, that generation, that would be the generation after the greatest generation. They went through that, and it really hurt their emotional state. And we saw that clear up. I saw that clear up to my dad's death in 2011. He was never the same man after the 1980s farm crisis. But, you know, the Federal Land Bank, PCA, whatever it was, whoever you were financing with were calling in loans left and right. People couldn't make their payments. And, you know, when the interest rates get up there, it's impossible to do. So,
Yeah, so do you want to tell people what it means to call in a loan?
well, yeah, I mean, if you have your land leveraged and you're depending on your agricultural enterprise to make the payments on that land, and let's just say back then interest rates started at 7 or 8%, and then by 1986 they were, you know, that would be the early 1980s. By 1986 they were up to 21%. Well, your agricultural enterprise was not making even the interest payments, much less the land principal payment. And so it just was like a snowball headed for hell, and these finance companies had to call in these notes, which means
Right. So
you had to pay the note, or they were taking your land or your product or whatever it was.
right. So even some people who could pay the interest rate still had their loans called in.
Correct.
So
Well,
you think you've got a long-term loan, and all of a sudden the bank says, oops, you know, we don't trust you. We're not sure you're going to continue to be able to pay. So even if you've been paying on time, we want to cancel this loan and we want you to give us the whole principal now. I believe that's happened to some farmers. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. There was a time that if you had a good creditor, they would likely let you, in the West at least, they would likely let you make the interest payment and hold over the principal payment. But after 2 or 3 years, you've got to do something, and so that's where the pressure came on.
So let's talk about consolidation. You called it centralization. Some people call it monopolization or cartelization. Talk about what that process is in farming.
Jim?
Yeah, and I've explained it more. There's kind of a common thought of these when people talk about factory farms coming in, and they think of giant corporations coming in and pushing the family farmer out, where I explain it more as that isn't really what's happening. What is happening is that family farmers have continuously gotten more and more pressure to operate like a factory, and the factory farm term is something that's pretty frowned upon in agriculture. People hate to hear it because they don't want to think of agriculture as a factory. And I would say it's still not, but when you think about the chicken industry, I've talked about my family. When my mom was a little girl, her dad milked cows. They had chickens. They sold the eggs. They sold the cream. They had hogs. They had beef cattle. And then they raised a variety of crops. I can remember my grandpa having oats in the barn that he grew on his place, and then hay and different crops. It was just way more diversified. But as these corporations have gained power, and there has been like a centralization of corporate control in agriculture, and just a specialization. Now those same farms that were that diversified are now corn, soybean rotation. And, ours is one of the few that still raise cattle I guess I shouldn't say few, but there's way, way less, that raise cattle. Like when I was a kid, we fed cattle, which is we would buy cattle and, a couple hundred cattle and feed them on our place. Those operations, and there was one, I used to say there was one about every section, which is about every square mile in Southwest Iowa. Those are all gone now. There are not, I guess there are a few, but they're very hard to find cattle feeding places that will feed out 100 or 200 head. Those have all been concentrated into, if someone feeds cattle in Southwest Iowa, you just assume there are probably 3,000 to 10,000 head of cattle at a time.
So why is that? How did this come about?
It was kind of a combination of things. Mainly, like, my family could kind of see the writing on the wall where it was going. In the late 90s, early 2000s, there was legislation. You hear about these environmental restrictions and people will think, oh, this is going to make the environment better. One of the things was they put a head limit on your feedlot, which I think was 300 at the time. And if you fed over 300 cattle, you then would have to build a manure lagoon. You couldn't be within a certain distance to a waterway. There was just a number of environmental regulations. And
let me ask you, why would the government decide that manure lagoons are better than spreading manure on your property to improve fertilization?
I think they just see it as a better, easier way to regulate. They can come by and make sure of what you're doing. Whereas if you're taking care of your own manure and spreading it on your own land, that's not easy to regulate. And back then there's a number of different reasons, but it's really kind of control. We want to control how these operations, and they did it in the name of the environment. And what that did is it concentrated everything. And so now, you could drive by our place and a lot of times not even smell the cattle. You are not driving by a 10,000 head feed yard now and not smelling the cattle. This term environment has come to encompass things, but people don't actually realize that it's like, the actual world around you, and the environment around a 10,000, 20,000 head feedlot is not as clean or nice a place as it was when you had them spread out all throughout the countryside in 100 to 300 head bunches. And so what that did is, the cost of putting those, the lagoon, and then a lot of guys would have like a center pivot that would spread the manure out, or liquid manure out of that lagoon, and you would have to have that on your place, and the costs were just crazy. So you either had the decision of you quit doing it, or you added on to the point where you could cover those costs, which was like a 2,000-3,000 head feed yard.
I think one of the main factors of that centralization is that Congress allowed the acquisitions and mergers of global corporate companies to take over American agriculture. And then within that, they had these highly paid lobbyists that lobbied for taxes and regulations on the small producer, just like what he's talking about, what Jim's talking about. And that forced a lot of independent ranchers out of the business. Let's take, for example, in 1998, when they allowed these acquisitions and mergers of the hog industry to be at an all-time high, or in 97, and then in 98, there were no independent hog producers on the land. The prices had got down to 8 cents a pound. And so that
Yeah,
forced
let me repeat that
producer.
for the audience. So what happened was these large hog companies decided to take a loss and undercut. So they would lose money on every hog, to push the small producers out of business so they could buy up their properties.
The meat packers actually they made money. The people buying the hogs were making money. But what they said was, so what happened was the industrialization of the hog industry, meaning instead of like my grandpa did, he would have hog huts that he would like move around in the fields, and they would just grow, they would house a few hogs, and then he made a hog building. I think he was able to, what they call farrow, which is you birth out litters of hogs. And I think it was somewhere around 40 to 50 hogs at a time. They built these buildings to where you could do 1,000 hogs at a time, and they're having litters of 6 to 8 at a time. So then what the packers would say is it created this oversupply. Well, at the same time, before that crash, they also reduced the number as this concentration was happening, and the number of packers was becoming much less. They also closed packing plants, which caused an oversupply.
Let's just tell the audience what a packer is. A packer is a slaughterhouse and a meat processing facility. So
Right.
They will often buy the animals from the farmer and process them, and those are called packers.
Yeah, they're kind of the end. The end. I mean, I guess retail would be the end, but they're the end as far as the animal is concerned of the supply chain. And yeah, so at that time, and they blamed it all on oversupply. They said, well, there's just so many hogs that they're not worth anything. But the price of pork didn't go down, and that's one thing I always
So the
point
farmer was
to
getting
as like
8 cents a pound, but the pork in the grocery store was maybe $3 a pound.
Yeah, I mean I don't know exactly what prices were back then, but it didn't change that much. And the packer at the time would say, well, there's just an oversupply of hogs. But to me, I always bring up the point, well, if you're actually competing for market space, why wouldn't the pork price continue to drop? If you're they were making record profits all through this. And it just didn't, is because they had all colluded and decided they aren't going to compete for market space. They're just going to keep their market space and continue to make these record profits. And that's what you're able to do when you get down to this small number of beef packers, or meat packers.
Okay, so let's go into what is a cartel. So a cartel is a small group of people in the same industry that collude together, right? So they decide illegally how they're going to manage these, hundreds or thousands of independent ranchers. And they say, look, we're all just going to pay this. We're going to complain. We're going to tell them we're not making any money, and we're going to push a lot of them out of business, and we're going to get their hogs for a very good price. Now, the federal government has laws against this. They're called antitrust laws, and some of them have been in place since 1890. But the federal government did not choose to prosecute anybody. They didn't investigate. They didn't enforce the laws. And so this caused a crisis at the time in hog farming, and all the hog farmers wound up changing. So talk about how the hog farmers went from being independent farmers to having to be essentially serfs on their land, and manage. They had to buy these large metal buildings to keep all the hogs in and grow the hogs for large corporations like Smithfield, which is now owned by a Chinese company. But they actually didn't own the hogs. They just got paid a certain relatively small amount to raise them, to have these manure pools on their properties, to damage their properties to an extent, and then have to fulfill contracts with large manufacturers. So how did that come about?
Really, the independent hog farmer was pushed out. He didn't even become a serf. He just had to go an alternative route, whether that was into the beef industry or what. What you're talking about is the poultry industry. In the West, the hog conglomerates, these corporates, this cartel you're talking about, came in and bought land in the West and started building their own facilities, to which still stand today. They are all full of these what a lot of people would call factory farmed hogs, and that independent farmer, a hog farmer, was gone overnight.
But I will say, if I could, in my part of the country, there was guys who were like, my grandpa built that building to farrow out 40 to 60 head of hogs, I can't remember. But there was guys who were convinced to build these giant buildings before the crash. And so when they did that, and then they said, well, we're oversupplied. Well, they had taken out loans, like we had talked about earlier, to build those buildings, and now they couldn't make the payment. So what they did was, these people that were making these record profits, the beef packer, like Tyson Foods, would bring them in and say, okay, you sign this contract to grow our hogs, and then we will pay you to do that. And so it was either kind of default on the loans or sign this contract and become, like what Shad always says, as a serf or an employee, really, to these. And the contracts are incredibly unfair. And you really get in the weeds when you get into the tournament system. But if people want to look up what the tournament system is for hog farming, and so they had to kind of either go bankrupt or sign this contract and become one of these contract farmers and in the Tyson system.
Shad, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, that's exactly what happened, and we no longer see independent hog producers. Now, hogs are not my forte. We're in the beef industry, but we've seen what they've done to the hog industry and certainly to the poultry industry, and that's exactly what Jim's talking about in this tournament system, where these people have become serfs, and then they pick. Those corporations pick winners and losers through that supply chain, or at least the production chain, which has caused an absolute mess. And that's exactly where they're trying to go in the beef industry. But I think because of our access to land, or our ownership of private property, and the amount of land it takes to produce a pound of beef or one head of cow, or however you want to talk about it, that is a little more difficult. And so that's why I say we're always, the beef industry is the last bastion of freedom, because we own that property, and it's hard to take control of an enormous industry the way they've done and used mass production in hogs and chickens.
So let me get into this a little more. Up until 1967, when Congress passed the Wholesome Meat Act, basically the states were regulating the cattle industry, and probably these other industries too. And suddenly the federal government came in and said, okay, we, with some excuse, like maybe there was an epidemic of some foodborne illness or something. And the federal government stopped allowing farmers to sell meat from their farm to the public. So the Fed said, no, we are going to inspect basically every bit of meat that you produce. So you can just forget about your local butcher and your local small meat packer. Now you're going to have to send your animals to a USDA inspected facility. And we're going to have to look at that animal before slaughter and then after slaughter, after we've done some processing. And so what this has done has reduced the number of slaughterhouses and meat processors around the country so in terms of USDA approved, inspected facilities now, there's maybe a quarter of what there was around about 1980. And they're a lot further away. So the farmers have to somehow manage to bring their animals to one of these packing companies, which can process up to several thousand animals a day and several million animals in a year, up to 3 to 5 million animals a year in one huge factory. What this means is that the farmers now have to make their animals travel a long distance. The packers say that they're a bottleneck, that there's not actually enough supply in terms of butchering and processing the animals. So you have, in certain parts of the country, you have to make an appointment a year to 2 years in advance to get your animals processed. This is before the animals may be even born. So you don't know how many animals you're going to have 2 years from now. You don't know what the market's going to be. You don't know what the prices are going to be, but you have to sign up for slaughtering a certain number of animals. And on the way there, they may die. You may have to truck them or walk them hundreds of miles. Even in Maine, you may have to go 200 or 300 miles to bring your animals to be processed. And, a lot can happen on the way, especially if you don't own the semi-truck that's carrying them. Somebody else does and may not be taking good care of your animals. So the farmers are then at the mercy of the processing company, what they're going to pay. So if okay, it's now, April, your time is due. We're going to process your animals. This is what the market is paying today. Take it or leave it, right? And you don't have any options because you don't want to take your animals another 500 miles and lose a couple of them en route. So I don't know what that is the situation around here. We don't have that many processing plants here in the East. And of course, I'm in Maine. But what's it like where you are?
Well, just real quick, I think what you're talking about is a function of centralization, right? And centralization has taken competition away. And with the lack of competition, the corporates have been able to take more control of local and regional packing companies, and that has been happening for a long time now. And so you do have this difficulty now. We're talking about, in my case, I'm a stocker operator and I own a yearling, and then I sell that animal off of grass to go to the next segment of the industry, which may be the feed yard, right? And then the feed yard grows it, and that animal is then sold to the packer, right? The packer comes to that. And so then they take those cattle to those big, what you're talking about, those big slaughter plants that kill 100,000 50 to 100,000 head a week to supply food for the nation. But when COVID came about, it really allowed people to recognize that was a dangerous situation, all this concentration of the meat industry into one place, because their shelves went empty, right? That's what happened. And so they're like, oh my gosh, how are we going to get meat? And so then we had a return to regional and local packing companies, which was actually helped funded by the government, but then they started putting in a few regulatory issues that was going to cost a lot of money. But at the end of the day, really, at least in my region, we still have access to smaller packing companies. They are fewer and far between, but that is not unusual in the West. But why they are is because of that centralization, and that has taken the competition part of it out. So it's put the independent packers out of business. We still have a few and have built a few of those in the Central Plains since COVID. So I think that we have taken some of that market share back from the four big packers, what we call them, and that has helped at least the farm to food movement, right? And so people are able to have easier access to their meat supply because of COVID. And then, of course, we still have this concentration issue. But overall, the whole reason they're farther between and we have to truck them further is because of these corporate companies coming together and buying, allowed by Congress to acquire and merge with these other packing companies, and it just results in less competition for the independent packer, right? That's how it kind of works.
So the top 4 companies in meat processing control 85% of the beef market in the United States, and 2.5 of those companies are foreign owned. Mm-hmm. So what we have is during COVID, some of these large processing companies shut down because there was COVID in the workplace. Well, these are, as you can see, huge industries. And it also turned out subsequently that a very large percentage, maybe 50% of their employees were immigrants, and some were legal and many were illegal immigrants. And so recently, once ICE shows up at a meat processing company, the next day, everybody doesn't come to work. And there have been those kinds. So during COVID, of course, it was supposedly COVID in the employees, but now ICE has affected this to the point that the Secretary of USDA, Brooke Rollins, had to go to President Trump and say, look, if we continue these raids on food processors, we're not going to have food in this country because we've just got too many undocumented immigrants working in them. And so Trump then backed off and they stopped the ICE raids. There was something else I was going to say, and now I've forgotten. But Jim, you had something to say.
Yeah, I was just going to talk about how Shad was talking about and he was completely right. It's an end result of this concentration, but it's also the government has been very involved in regulating small lockers. And there is the Prime Act.
Jim, what's a locker?
So we talked about Packer, which is your major corporate, just a large, like a Tyson Foods, Smithfield in the pork. And then your locker is in rural America. We have local places we can take our animals and have them butchered. So that, a lot of times, like before COVID, it was just for our own use, or you'd sell one to a neighbor here or there. But I actually started to try to sell direct in the early 2000s. I think it was 2004, 2005. And we had to find a local or a USDA inspected locker. And that's, I think, more what you were talking about. And that means a USDA inspector has to be on site when the animal is killed and has to oversee the entire process of butchering the animal. And that is because of the government regulations. And I talk a lot about how in Brazil, all of these companies, we have 20 different countries that import beef into the U.S., and they're not regulated. There's no USDA inspector on site at those places, and the USDA actually only looks at them. They go and inspect the facility every 2 to 3 years, I believe, and make sure that they're able to import beef into our country. But if you're a local farmer, you are more heavily regulated than actually the foreign beef packers. And so there has been legislation repeatedly to reduce those regulations and make it easier for farmers to sell their meat locally. And that because of the corporate lobbyists and the corporate concentration and the control of the USDA, that has never been passed. And that I can remember the Prime Act being talked about back in the early 2000s, and it's been introduced who knows how many times. Thomas Massey now is the congressman who's introduced it the last couple sessions of Congress, and it doesn't go anywhere. But
this year it's got 9 sponsors in the Senate and 40 something in the House. So it is more, it's in a more favorable climate now than ever before, the Prime Act. And we talked about it on my show actually last week. So what the Prime Act would do is to open the markets so that people could go to what are called custom slaughterhouses, where they don't have a USDA inspector on constantly. They're just inspected, occasionally, maybe comparable to, probably better than what an import might do, an importing company. But they haven't had any problems. The state regulates them and is fine with them. And this would then allow those custom slaughterhouses, which are small, and which previously they weren't allowed to sell to the public. They could process your meat for you and give it back to you, and you could use it yourself, but you weren't, and you could give it away, but you weren't allowed to sell it, actually. This would finally enable these small processors that are probably a lot cleaner than these huge companies to sell locally within the state that they're in. They could sell to the public, they could sell to restaurants and facilities like nursing homes and hospitals. So this would really open things up for farmers because, as I said, up until 1967, they were able to access local markets for meat. And subsequently, the federal government hasn't allowed that. And in Maine, when we actually got a change in our Constitution to allow free access to food, and we also got a law passed in Maine for free access to food, the USDA came to Maine and said, look, if you include meat in this law and in this constitutional change, we're not going to let you run your state inspections or your custom slaughterhouses. We're going to come in and take over the whole thing. So our state had to back off because the United States government heavied us. And we're hoping that with the Prime Act, that will go away. And there's another potential bill that my organization is very interested in pushing, which would allow farmers to sell, as they can do vegetables and fruit now, but they can't do meat, to sell direct to consumer if they butcher the animal themselves on the farm, that they could sell on farm. If a consumer could drive to the farm and buy that cow. Right now, he can't unless he already owns the cow and you raised it for him, or he owns half the cow or a quarter of the cow in certain states. That's the only way a consumer can go to a farm and actually get cuts of meat, as if they've already paid for them ahead of time. But with a bill like this, it would allow people to go to the farm. The farmer could slaughter and butcher or get an itinerant butcher to come along and butcher the meat for him and sell directly to the consumer, because now the farmer is usually getting 15 to 30 cents. That's it, 15 to 30 cents on the dollar of what that meat goes for in a grocery store. In the old days, before 1980, before the U.S. government started really enforcing these new laws, the farmer and the rancher got 70 cents on the dollar for the meat they sold. So what's happened is a corporatization, the centralization, cartelization of the meat industry has taken these prosperous farmers and turned them into barely surviving farmers. If they didn't already own the land, they'd be gone. They'd be gone. These guys, luckily, they're fifth generation. They were able to get the land from their families, so they're not into terrible debt. The whole industry, the farming and ranching industry, is over $500 billion in debt. So when interest rates go up, the farmer is screwed, basically. And let me repeat that. It's about $540 billion, which is more than $500 billion of farm debt in the United States. So, and farmers have taken on debt to buy land, to put these buildings up. The cost of seed, the cost of fertilizer, the cost of pesticides, if they use them, has gone up 30 to 40% since 2020. Whereas the amount they're getting for their food, apart from the fact that beef, so there were so few cows last year because of all these pressures. There was a record low number of cows. There was a shortage of meat. And so briefly, the cost of cows has gone up. And so farmers are now making money off cattle. But next year they probably won't. Or they may next year, but then the year after they won't. And the federal government could fix a lot of these problems actually by doing less regulation that is really deliberately harmful to the smaller guys and favorable to the larger guys. And let me,
Well, one thing they
let's
could do,
go
Marilyn,
ahead.
one thing they could do is enforce those antitrust laws that you were talking about. That's all they would have to do.
Absolutely.
And that has been done before. My good friend
Many
Mike Callick,
times before.
yeah, Mike
So,
Callicrate, my good friend, says break them up. That's what they need to do. Is they need to break these corporations that are illegally monopolizing, breaking antitrust laws. They need to break them up.
so this was done in the 1890s and it was done in the 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
But we have allowed this cartelization to really move forward since about 1980, the 1970s, I
And
would
that's
say.
on the
That's when
backs
it
of the
really took off.
lobbyists.
Yeah, lobbyists. And, when four companies control 67% of pork in the United States and 85% of beef, and some enormous amount of the processing of soy and corn and wheat. The consumer and the farmer are at the mercy of these large corporations. And people think our food is cheap in the United States. Well, maybe it was cheap, but it isn't cheap anymore. If you go to Europe, you go to other countries, and I've gone into the grocery stores in other countries, and I thought, I know we used to have cheap food, but we don't. Our food is, yeah, I mean, things like cheese are about 3 times more expensive, as in Spain. Spain grows a lot of fruits and vegetables. And you could buy oranges for almost nothing in Spain. I would go to the grocery store and it would be really a half to a third of what I would pay in the United States. So we have to break them up. Our organization is actually exploring what can be done to try to push the federal government to enforce the antitrust laws. And I'm really glad you brought that up. You want to talk about the ear tag issue, which is another way the government is making it hard on small farmers.
There has been a push to mandate electronic identification ear tags in the cattle industry, and they already have like a segment where certain types of animals have to wear electronic ear tags, and they do that. Yeah, so if you see when we talk about ear tags, it's just a tag in the ear. And at the top of those tags right there was a round piece, and that is what they used to call RFID, which is radio frequency identification, and now they call it EID, which just means it's the same thing, but it just means that some of them aren't radio frequency, and they do that their reasoning is they say traceability for disease control, but it just so happened at the same time that they wanted to do that, there was all kinds of climate issues and this whole push to regulate methane and to reduce methane and kind of track your greenhouse gas emissions and what those ear tags are, and they'll tell you they're tracking animal disease, but it's also a way to track greenhouse gas emissions. And those ear tags can hold any sort of information. There's no limit to the amount of information they can force you to put it on them. And so they've mandated ear tags and what we have described as incrementalism, meaning right now you just have to put the tag in if you're selling a certain kind of animal over state lines, or that's what they told you when they put the mandate in. But then what they did is they told all the veterinarians who are required to vaccinate for a certain disease in cattle. They call it Bangs tag, which is it's just a vaccination for a certain disease. And they used to come out and put a metal tag in your ear to certify that animal was vaccinated. Well, they've gotten rid of the metal tags and the USDA has told veterinarians they can only use EID tags. So it now is not just that certain class of cattle that is going over state lines. Now it's every animal that's being kept for breeding that is getting that vaccination. And so just within a year, it's really been a fraudulent way of going about it, because they said this is the regulation, and then they took away the old tags and put in the new and told veterinarians the only way to do it is this way. Mm-hmm. And they're forcing ranchers to do. Vet comes out and those are the only tags he has, and so then you have them. And eventually, this has been pushed for years and years and years. And the whole goal is to get every animal with these tags and then eventually regulate the information that ends up on those tags.
Right, exactly. And Denmark is charging farmers already a tax on belches of all of their livestock. And the tax is going up every year for 5 years. So by 2030, farmers in Denmark is expected to pay roughly $100 a year for every cow that they own to compensate for their belching. Do you want to talk about other ways that global warming and climate change, that using that as sort of an excuse to impact farmers? What's happening in that sphere?
Yeah, I mean, it goes into what I just talked about with the ear tags, but then also during the Biden administration, there was a program that was put out. They spent $3 billion, no congressional approval. This is just from the USDA. It was called the Climate Smart Commodity Program. And all of this money went to organizations or corporations. And their goal, the USDA said, well, that money was supposed to funnel down to farmers and ranchers, and these organizations and corporations were supposed to get farmers and ranchers to sign up to measure their greenhouse gas emissions and get into these programs. And what I have talked about over the past year is that this program was created to just create a system that would eventually regulate all greenhouse gas emissions. It's become very obvious. But then also, I think there is a goal with corporations. The corporations really push this carbon market. And, they want to get in on that. It's propaganda towards, ADM is one of the largest ag corporations in the world. They got $90 million out of this climate smart commodity deal. And, they're big into the carbon pipeline, the carbon sequestration, and all of that goes back into, they're able to make money. They get tax credits. They're able to sell carbon credits. I guess if you want to get into, there's news today of people dying in a dairy in Colorado from these noxious gases that were created by, this concentrated of methane. That dairy has a methane digester, which they sell for carbon credits. I read the thing this morning and it said they were supposed to be able to make $20 million a year on this. They create natural gas out of methane, which has been explained that the actual market value is 10 times less of what they're getting paid for it, but they're getting paid so much because of the carbon market system. And it gets very complicated, but it's just kind of this whole house of cards that's created there's just nothing behind it. And what I've talked about and what we've talked about on the podcast is getting truth back into agriculture, meaning let's sell food, let's grow food, good food for people, and not, this push from the USDA and these corporations is to get us, not focused on food, but have this whole entire different market set up that is based on nothing,
climate change,
just lies.
right?
Yeah.
Ameliorating climate change, which is just
Right.
a fake story from day one that they've pushed on us. And if you were a meteorologist that didn't go along with it, you lost your job. So they managed to get all these meteorologists to go along. Well, yeah, after you spend all these years going to school, that's what people do.
Well, it's all about
Fortunately,
picking winners and losers, right?
absolutely.
This
The
we
whole story
talk
has
about
been about that.
yeah, we talk about the ED, and Jim touches on it very well and eloquently. But the EID is all about tracking data, and that data is the information they want. And if you don't track your own data and the information they want, then you don't enter the market system. And we've seen that across the globe in the name of climate change, and they call it sustainability. Well, sustainability is nothing more than production and consumption control. They're going to control what we produce and what we consume, and that is ultimately collectivism.
Yes, absolutely. You've put it in a nutshell. It's all about and there are large cattle ranches where only one cow, they only did one ear tag for the large ranch, but then for the small guys, every cow has to be tagged. And I think another reason to do that is to get us all accustomed to the idea, well, if animals have to be tagged and send out radio frequency or whatever messages to the cloud, the air, so that whoever is driving by can pick them up. It's not as far a stretch for them to require us to do the same thing.
It's environmental social governance, ESG. That's exactly what it is. It's the triple bottom line of sustainable development.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. And we really have to stop this now. It has
Yes.
gone too far. President Trump is doing some things to stop it. He did have a really good Department of Energy report come out in July talking about, the real truth about climate change and warming and cooling and all of that. And he is canceling a lot of these programs, but they haven't canceled them all from the USDA. And that's something we're going to need to work on. Look,
There's a lot of issues that the USDA that we need to work on. One of them is One Health under the APHIS, agency of APHIS, which just puts people, planet, and animals on the same level. And that is part of the ESG, or the sustainable development. It's a very scary situation. Some of these things that they promised that they would get off of there and get out in the name of climate change have not been nixed yet, and we're waiting for that to happen.
Right. And let me also say, things are relatively good for us here in the US, because at least we have an administration at the moment who doesn't believe in all this stuff. But in the rest of the developed world, in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, they're still going along with the sustainable development goals, the One Health, and I've talked a lot about One Health in the past. Look, if the audience wants more, I'm happy to give it to them.
Well, we can thank our Constitution. That is what has kept us from going full collectivist, Doctor. And we can just thank our forefathers who had the vision to know what was going to happen, and that Constitution has really been the foundation of why we are still a free nation today.
Thank you. Great way to end. The Constitution is the foundation of trying to maintain our freedom here in this country. One Health is just another false narrative that was created out of thin air, just like carbon credits. A fake concept to develop markets so that people who get in on the beginning can make a lot of money, and then the whole thing will blow up later. We're going to have to end now, but it's been such a pleasure having you on, and I just thank you very much for sharing your deep information with us and with the audience of CHD.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having us on.
Tell everyone your name, please.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Cassandra Palmer. I go by Cassie for short. I am here today, I guess, to tell my story, our family story, which began shortly after my son's MMR vaccine in early 2000s. He had the seizure, the full thing, seizure, high fever, and regressed and became nonverbal, staring off into nothingness. And it was around this time Dr. Andy Wakefield came out, and he was a godsend. It was from his statement, his testimony, and sharing all the work he'd done on the gut biome. So I seeked out a physician in the metro Atlanta area that helped me with my son. And I quit my job and helped get him back on track. Now, what brings me to you all today was I actually signed this up on accident, but I felt like it was meant to be by the universe, so I'm going to just keep going. So when I did decide to start going back to work, I ended up in the unlikeliest of places in a work comp sales support role. And I would assign catastrophic nurse case managers to work comp injuries, and also do something called medical bill reviews and medical cost projections. There's a lot of fancy terms for a lot of money in the industry and where you can save money. I got to learn how the ins and outs of the claims community, because I ended up doing group health as well. But what I ended up discovering was in America, the standard of care is set, honestly, by Center for Medicare Services, and there's a full racket around that as it goes to insurance companies and how they claim, what they set their prices at versus what Medicare says is a fair and appropriate price. This is all based off of a cost to charge. So every procedure that's ever done has to be submitted to CMS, and doctors, whatever it costs, has to be submitted to CMS every year, Center for Medicare Services. They determine what a profit margin is, and from there set whatever the allowable is for your knee replacement, your whatever. Okay, so that's one cost, and then they take into account regions. That said, in the group health space, there is a racket, basically, and I don't know how to say it another way, and I had to leave because I couldn't keep representing what we were doing. I ended up getting into something called reference-based pricing, which goes into ERISA law and causes a whole nother issue, but essentially, we're fighting the hospitals and overpriced billing. And I didn't mean to go into this, but I figure the general public needs to know this, that there is an egregious price difference and you need to fight. It's the same as if you buy a lawnmower or something. In a way, let me say it a different way. The hospital industry is the only industry where you walk in the door and you're signing on the dotted line that you're going to agree to pay for everything and everything they're going to do to you without even knowing what that price is. It's the only industry that happens. And it's not right. And so there's got to be, there is some stuff and legal stuff that's going on with that. But long and short, I left this world, this corporate world, and during all this, from my son's brain injury in early 2000, that we also had a house of mold that we were living in, same time. We got out of that. My husband at the time got out unscathed. I had a ton of health issues, wasn't sleeping, digestive, all sorts of stuff. But yeah, he ended up with a brain tumor called an oligodendroglioma, and ended up with a secondary brain injury from over-radiation of the tumor site. That caused me, if it wasn't for working in the work comp community and have my nurse case manager friends, I wouldn't have known he needed a neuropsych exam, because what I was seeing was worse than when he had a tumor. The behavior, he was acting like Jim Morrison. I mean, I was pretty sure I was going to find him dead in a bathtub, drinking, and I don't know. It was crazy, and it still is crazy, as a matter of fact. So, gosh, that was 2009. He is 49, 50 now. It started in like 39, I think, is when it showed up. So, yeah. But anyhow, so that started me down the road of brain injury, because I needed supports. I mean, it was kind of crazy around my house. And plus, I had Gabe I was dealing with, and then my own health issues. And we have other children. Anyhow, long and short, somehow as I was leaving the corporate world, I wasn't leaving yet. This is the beginning of COVID. And I kept going down more and more rabbit holes, so to speak. We all know that here in the truther community. But we were facing that vaccine mandate at my work, and I worked from home doing sales support, and I was already fighting them, and I was like, no, listen, this is not a law. And I went through all that. So I was ready to leave, and a friend had kept asking me to take over as the executive director for Brain Injury Association of Georgia. And I was like, oh God, no, that sounds awful. But anyhow, I ended up taking the job, and as I've been here, we've done some great work. But what I'm really here to say today is talk about today is more on the brain injuries. And so I'm here today personally, but also in the fact that we represent brain injury in Georgia. I have seen an uptick. It's typically been historically traumatic brain injuries caused by a concussion, a car accident, a fall, something trauma to the head. Those are typically the higher amount of calls that we see in the state. That changed this year. Those calls are now, it's flipped. So 2/3 of our calls now are acquired brain injuries from stroke, heart attack, vaccine injury, undisclosed, long COVID, and other things. But then also we have TBIs are still continuing because there's also a huge accidental force out there going on. So I guess what am I here to say today is we are seeing the effects of the vaccine and the jabs. And I have lived my entire life trying to do the right thing and do what people have told me to do, our doctors, our government, only to find it's hurt me. I've got injuries too. I was given tetracycline as a child, ruined my teeth. Apparently, if you do an autopsy on me, apparently my bones have gray rings if you had tetracycline. And I don't know, but you can't sue them and you can't do anything about it. And it's, my husband ended up with a TB, basically we couldn't even call it a TBI, but I don't know how it can't be a TBI when you've been over lasered at the tumor site. And then I can tell you from my time in the claims community, doing a medical cost analysis or a Medicare set-aside report, that means you have to look at someone's injury and get an idea of what it's going to cost for the lifetime of that claim. And the biggest cost, what do you think it is? It's pharmaceuticals by a gazillion. I mean, the dollar amounts in each of these traumatic cases or any kind of catastrophic case. Now, this could be burns. It doesn't have to be brain injury. I'm talking about work comp injuries. It could be anything, right? I've seen some horrific cases. But yeah, the industry, it's corrupt, it's wrong, and it needs to stop. And I know I have data and real life experience to bring to the table. So I just probably fired myself on camera, being that I'm with Brain Injury Association of Georgia. I have no idea how this is going to turn out. And I am also here today to contact Memorial Hospital and find out what's going on with their rehab for brain injury. So I am working in pleasure. So
Thank you. Quick question. Did you take the COVID shot?
no.
Did you get COVID?
Yes, in 2019 before it was announced, and at the time I was doing benefit open enrollment meetings, and I think I got it in St. Louis.
and so you're alive, which is great.
Yeah.
So because we're led to believe that you will die if you don't take the COVID shot. How did you treat it?
So it's funny, I didn't know what it was. I just know it was going on forever, and it was 2 weeks in. And so I come from a farmer family in Pennsylvania and stonemasons, and we love the land, and I went back to our old school remedy, and what got me over it was wormwood. I do wormwood extract. I treat our family for parasites monthly during the full moon cycle or quarterly, depending on where we've been and what we've been doing, and that is what ended it. And that was after I went to, gosh, I missed the entire holidays in December. Like, I got it literally the 23rd of December. Sometime in January is when, and that was when I was like, this has got to be a parasite or something. So that's how I got over it. And then I had a secondary bout with it when I had a nephew living with me that was vaccinated. And I was like, oh my God, this is COVID. So once again, wormwood and HCQ.
Well, thank you, and thank you for telling the story. Thank you for everything.
Awesome. Thank you.
History doesn't wait. This is our moment to rise, unite, and reclaim our children's health.
Join us here in Austin, Texas this November at the Children's Health Defense Conference.
In the wake of unprecedented medical overreach and censorship, the world is waking up, and people like you are leading the way.
We're at a turning point in history. With the pandemic behind us, our fight for freedom and health has reached the global stage.
This is our moment of truth, and we're ready to seize it together.
And Children's Health Defense has been at the forefront of this charge. Our 2025 conference brings together the leaders, visionaries, and warriors who made it happen.
Meet the parents whose lives were forever changed, and hear from doctors who risked everything to speak out. Stand with those who refuse to be silenced.
You are going to hear from world-renowned speakers, doctors, and frontline leaders driving the medical freedom movement.
Discover real-world solutions grounded in science, integrity, and human rights.
Join the discussion to talk about vaccines, informed consent, parental rights, and so much more.
And you'll, of course, hear from your favorite CHD personalities, sharing the latest on CHD's research, litigation, and outreach.
And while you're there, soak up the energy, culture, and music of beautiful Austin, Texas.
Whether you're a parent, a practitioner, or a medical freedom advocate, this is your call to action to protect what matters most.
Be part of the movement that is rewriting the story for generations to come.
So please join us.
Join us.
Join us. Let's make history together in Austin.